Now the sun had beaten down all day, and he was used to the heat. But now, by the banks of the River Thames, all he could think about was his journey back to India. He'd waited by the docks, but now he was trying to get some shelter in the shadow of the trees by the edge of the Thames, and all he could think of was going back to his home. For he was tall and he was strong, and he had used his long, thin fingers to take what was not his, for he had stolen a bar of gold, not so small that it couldn't be seen, but now it rested in the pack at his back. And he thought to himself that he would be like a king. He would be like a king when he returned home, for he would sell that gold and he would keep it for himself. But not only this, he had stolen a sword. But as he lay there, he couldn't believe it, because the temperature was high, but the level of the water, the River Thames, even though there hadn't been one single drop of rain for 3 weeks, the level was rising. And from his hiding place, he had to move. He could feel the gold in the pack at his back, and it felt heavy. Somehow, in the time that since he'd been lying down, it had become heavier. But he didn't mind. But now he had to move out amongst all of the sailors and all of the people who were there by the side of the wharves at the banks of the Thames, and they could tell that there was something heavy at his back. But he didn't mind, because all he could think about was how he was going to be like a king when he sailed across the sea and returned to his home. He hadn't been in London long, but he could see trains, and he knew that there would be trains in India soon. They sent sparks and fire and smoke into the air, and the bar of gold that he'd stolen seemed to become even heavier. All on that journey far across the sea, sailing from London and back to India, he just licked at his lips and thought to himself how rich he was going to be when he got home. But it was when he picked up that pack and tried to carry it that he found that it was much heavier. But he didn't mind. It was almost as if the gold had grown inside of his back. And he put it on his back, and he found it hard to stagger down the streets. So now he put it down and he started to pull it, but it was still too heavy. The only way that he could pull it was if he put it over his shoulders and dragged it. And as he dragged it, he thought that he was stronger than he had thought, for the bag seemed to be even lighter. And now he could walk easily. He could walk easily and pull the bag, and he could hear children behind him. They were laughing, shouting and yelling. And it was only as he turned around that he realized that as he had dragged the bag, it had ripped and torn and scattered the gold upon the ground. People came up to him. "Thank you, thank you. You have made all of our lives better. You have given us all gold. Now we have food in our belly, and we can grow plants and trees, and we shall be able to have fresh water on our farms. Oh, thank you, thank you." Nobody had ever said thank you to him before, and he did not like it. He would walk down the streets and people would smile at him. "Thank you." But under his breath, for he was as poor as he had ever been, under his breath he would mutter, "Do not say thank you to me." He did have a choice. He'd always had a choice ever since he was young. But the path that he chose was a one that was lined with evil. For he would take things that did not belong to him. And he would always say that it wasn't me, I didn't mean to do it. But now he was a full-grown man, and finding himself floating in a colony far out in space, he knew what it was to be weightless. He knew what it was to have evil course through his veins and arteries. But now, he would steal anything that he could. Now, it wasn't just a case of stealing for its own sake, but if he could spoil it for other people, if he could take something that was precious to someone else, then that made it all the sweeter. His skin was white, for he never allowed himself to go and stand in the UV bays. He had never known what a true sun was like to lie upon his skin. But he would always wear dark clothes, because that made it easier for him to hide beside the steel walls of this outer space colony. And now, he'd heard tell that there was going to be a consignment of food coming in, and in outer space, orbiting a great moon, in outer space, food was a greater commodity than gold or silver or diamonds. And when he heard that that was coming in, then he decided that he would steal some. And the way that he decided to steal was he would time it. He would give himself a certain amount of time, that by the time that the silvered moon had passed 3 times across the horizon of the outer arm of this great space colony, that was how he would steal for how long. But not only that, he would decide how many times by throwing a die. He would roll it and throw it, and this time he rolled it and he threw it, and it landed upon the number 4. So he knew that by the time that the moon had passed 4 times across the horizon of this great space colony, he would have stolen not once, not twice, not 3, but 4 times. On the docking bay with his cloak about him, he could not be seen. The first thing that he saw was a box that was filled with food. He knew that he could not pick it all up, but he knew that he could spoil it. And if he were to spoil it, then that was like stealing, for no one else could use it. So he licked upon his long, thin finger and wiped it across the top of all of the food, and no one else would be able to eat it except him. For he, out of the goodness of his heart, would say, "Oh, I will save everybody here on the space colony, because I will eat it, and I will have this," smiling to himself, knowing that he was the only one who could eat it. He would often sit in his lonely room on the long, thin iron streets of the spaceship. So now he'd stolen once, and that was a good thing. And then he looked behind all of the great boxes, and there he could see that there was a small package, and he wondered what it was. He ripped and tore at the outer covering and found that inside of it there was paper. Paper. Well, if nothing else, it would stop those who would write to those loved ones who weren't on the space colony. And that was a good thing. And he tucked it inside of the huge pocket inside of his cloak, and now he went this way and that. Now, all of this time, he thought that no one could see him, but up in one corner of the room, there was a camera that was watching him. It would turn and follow his every movement, and he didn't know of the eyes that were watching him. But he saw that there was a box. It was long, and it was round, and it didn't weigh very much. But when he opened it, he found that there was inside of it a stick. "A stick," said the old man. "A stick. What good is a stick to anyone?" Now, he was old, but there was one inhabitant of this colony who was even older than him, who through weightlessness, through the fact that he'd lived so many years, could no longer walk in the way that he could, and the stick meant everything to him, for he would use it to walk, so that he could get from one edge of the steel town to another. And it was then that a thin smile crossed this man's lips. "Good. If I take that, then he will have to hobble, and that is a good thing." And just as he was about to try and think of what it was he could steal next, for he'd stolen not once, not twice, but 3 times, he felt a hand upon his shoulder. Now, he had been in many fights, and he had a scar above one eye from someone that he had stolen from, who had shown him in the only way that they could just how they thought about him. And when he felt guilty, which wasn't very often, the scar above one eye would throb with pain and remind him. And now it throbbed. And he turned and looked, and he saw that there was a girl. The girl looked and said, "I've been watching you. I've seen what you've stolen, and you've got a good haul, but there is one thing in amongst all of this consignment in the cargo bay that I think you would like, because it will show you things that you have never seen before." The old man looked at her and said, "But I have travelled to many moons. I have stood upon thousands of planets, and I have seen things that would turn your blood to water. There is nothing that I haven't seen." The girl, who was unbowed, looked at him. "But there is one thing that will show you things that you have never seen." She pointed to one package. Out of curiosity, the old man pulled back his cloak, went over to it, tore it open, and found inside that there was a lens. "Well, I have seen things like this before." But the girl was gone. He wondered if he would be able to see things that he'd never seen before. And here he took the lens and raised it towards his eye. But as soon as it came close, it clamped itself right against his skin, and he could not pull it free. He shouted, screamed, yelled, and bawled to the girl. But it was then that he looked around, and he could see things that he had never seen before. For with the lens over his eye, he could see all of the terrible things that he had done in the past. When he went back to his small and lonely room, the walls were piled high with the things that he had stolen, and with each one he could see the things that he had done, and he could not pull that lens away from his eye. But it was when he tried to sleep, with the lens there, embedded by the side of his eye, that he would dream and see things, for he had never seen what he had done to people when he had stolen things from them. He could see the things that he had stolen as a child, as a boy, as a man, as a young man. And now he could find no peace. The girl was right. With the lens at his eye, he did see things that he had never seen before. Standing up to her waist in the slime of the spooky river, she wished that she'd had a few more friends. But this was exactly what she deserved, for she was not the tallest of girls, and neither was she the thinnest of girls. But you could definitely say that she was the most aggressive girl that you have ever met in the whole of Australia. She would put her small hands into hard fists and scream and yell and shout until she got exactly what she wanted. I think the most surprising thing was that she had any friends in the first place, but they dared each other to go and stand by the edge of the spooky river. That wasn't just what it was, that was what everyone called it. For in the green and lush pasture land in Australia, when the sun would shine and the rain would fall, everything would be green and verdant. But not by the side of this river, and that's why it got its name, the Spooky River. For nothing grew in that place. It was thick and muddy and sluggish, and you could not say that it flowed. It dragged its heels as it moved, and still nothing would grow in that place, not by the side of that river. But she'd shouted too loud, raised a fist too many times, and now her friends had pushed her in and they were walking away. She screamed, she yelled, she bawled, howled, hollered, but it didn't make any difference. She was there in amongst all of the rubbish, for everything would be thrown into the river. People decided that if there was nothing going to grow in that place, well, they might as well fill it with their rubbish, their litter, their old belongings that they could not be bothered to bring to the city dump. It had once been a good river. It had flowed fast and sleekly because that place had been a cattle station, and the cattle would come and they would feed by the edge of the fast-flowing river that had once run in this place. Many people said that that was the reason why the river didn't flow, for the carcasses of the cattle had fallen into the water, and the water would not flow from that time. But the girl didn't think about the history, as she was now up to her waist on this mid-autumn day. In Australia, it's not a case of the snow would fall or rain would fall heavily. It becomes colder. But now she looked, and up into the sky she could see that there were clouds forming. And if there were clouds forming, then that would mean there would be rain. And if there was rain, then it would fall into the water, fall into the river. And she could see it patter, pitter, pitter, patter, patter, falling on top of the thick green sludge of this river. But she tried to climb her way out. And as she tried to climb her way out, her hands would brush against all of the things that had been thrown into the river, flung in that place. And her hand rested against, well, she couldn't believe it, but it was a phone. A phone such as she had never seen before. An old phone. Even the photographs of her great-grandfather hadn't had a phone that looked as old as this. It had a place where you could speak into, and a piece that you could hold up to your ear. And perhaps it was out of curiosity, and she thought that she could not get any dirtier than she already was. She ran her fingers through her now dirty blonde hair, and picked up the piece that she placed to her ear, and it was then that she heard a voice. "Well, my dear, if you would wish to get out of this river, then you'll need to ask." She was quite surprised, because she couldn't work out who it was who was speaking to her. And as she looked around her, she saw that there was a house, an old house made out of corrugated and rusty iron. She'd never seen it there before. And she had been to this place many times, and lots of people were too scared to come to the edge of the spooky river. And she held it up again. She wanted to speak and ask who it was. "Well, my dear, are you going to ask for some help?" "I do not ask for help from anyone." "Well, in that case, my dear, you had better hope that you can climb out of the river." And with that she tried to scramble away, but her hands were covered in the sludge and the slurry that was there in the river, and it was as if her hands were covered with oil, and she slipped and fell back in. Now a shadow that was as dry as the ground was starting to get wet. A shadow of a man with a hat upon his head, a leather coat upon his back, in the way that she'd seen in the history books. She saw a man standing there, an old man with a stick in his hand. And now he was resting by the edge of the river, and it seemed as if he wasn't getting wet himself. "Well, my dear, if you would wish to be brought out of the river, you will have to whisper for my help." "I do not whisper to anyone." "I think that you'll find that the water is rising." And it was true. The water was rising. She could see all kinds of things floating past her, and she looked and she scrambled again and slipped further down. "If you want my help now, since you have not whispered, then you will have to make it as quiet as a sigh." "I do not ask anyone for their help." But he looked. A sigh. No louder than a sigh. She could feel herself slipping, falling into the water. And rather than drown in amongst all of the mud and the slurry, she reached out. "Please help me." He reached down, and it seemed as if he could walk on the mud at the banks of the river, and he was not going to slip or slide, and he reached down and pulled her out. "Now, my dear, you need to think about the way that you will behave from this time, and I will give you something." And he placed into her hand a ball of paper. "If you use it well, then it will help you, but look over there." The girl turned and looked, and as she looked around, he had gone. The house was gone. There was a rusty mark upon the ground, and 4 posts that had been pushed into the ground, just like the old drover stations. She looked at the paper. The paper was old. The paper had writing upon it. She needed to read with her glasses to see what it was, but it spoke and said, "If you wish to help anyone, then help them willingly, with a hand, not as a fist, but in friendship. If you have to speak to them, do not shout, but whisper." She went back to the town. She spoke of her story, but only as a whisper. And she heard of how the last drover who looked after the cattle had had his daughter, who was not the thinnest girl in the world. His daughter, who was not the quietest girl in the world. She had slipped and fallen and drowned in the water, and he had stayed in that place. Some had said that he was nothing more than a shadow or a whisper in the air, and it had all happened 150 years ago, and no one had ever seen him except for her in that mid-winter. She looked about her. She realized that she could change her ways, and now she would have to go and she would travel from place to place. And where once she could fill a room with her shouting, now she would stand in with a quiet voice, a voice so quiet that you would need a microphone to be heard. She would speak and talk of the things that she had seen and done on that day, and how it had changed the way that she had lived her life. And as she grew older, she became a woman, and she would rest by the banks of the spooky river that she had cleaned herself. She'd cleaned everything out. And she would stand there and look and smile, and when the wind blew over the fast-flowing water, she would whisper to the old man who had appeared to her, she would whisper, "Thank you," no louder than a sigh. He hated the taste of fish, but that didn't stop him fishing. He would cast his line out on the fast-flowing deep river and catch as many fish as he could, because they were not for himself. These were dangerous times when the king had changed the religion, and this boy, who was rich and helpful, didn't care. If he could see people with hunger in their eyes, then he would make sure that they had something to eat. And the only thing that he could get was fish from out of the river. If he was to mention it to his mother or his father, then there would be trouble. They would follow him, and they would say, "You can only feed those that follow our religion." He didn't like the way that it had divided families. Cousins would not speak to sisters, and they would not all be together anymore. It was as if someone had split the country in half, but not upon a line, but through families. And now, many people could not work, and he would make sure that he could give those who were less fortunate than himself, he could give them something to eat. And now he fished, and cast in his line, and he brought in the fish, and he had caught not one, not 5, but 10 fish. They lay silvery in the sunlight by the banks of the river. But it was only as he looked down and he was just about to pick the fish up that a shadow was cast over them. And then he looked and he could see that there was a rich man with a sword by the side of his belt. And before he had a chance to reach for those fish, this rich gentleman spoke to him and said, "I've seen you, and I know what it is that you do. You feed those who do not follow the king's religion. And these are dangerous times. And you had better make sure that you give to those that are of the same religion as I." The boy wondered what this rich gentleman was going to do, but he could see him fingering the sword, and he looked, and there was the sign of the cross at its top, and he wondered. But before he had a chance to speak his fears, The rich man said, I will play a game with you, a wager. We shall roll and throw a die to find out who shall win the fish and decide who gets to eat this evening. But remember this, there is more at stake than fish upon a plate. For I shall throw first. And so the rich man did. And he threw once and 5 times, and 5 fish were won by him. But again, the 6th, the 7th, the 8th, the 9th, and now there was only 1 fish left. There was a dark tone to this gentleman's voice. He looked at the boy and said, if I win this last fish, then your life shall be forfeit for all that you have done. The boy was frightened, but he threw it and rolled it. And sure enough, the number came up as 11. He thought that this would be his chance, for if he was to win at least 1 fish, then he would be able to feed those who were less fortunate than himself, those who had hunger in their eyes. The rich man cast the die. It rolled this way and that. It rolled upon the 12, but then it rolled down to a 5. You are lucky, boy, for your life would have been forfeit. And I will give you the 1 fish, but take care. Take care that you follow the right religion. The boy shook and shivered, quaked and quivered, but he took the last fish and thought that he would make sure that he could cook it. And those people that he knew who were hungry, who had hunger in their eyes, he would not be able to give them 1 fish each, but they would have at least a mouthful, a morsel of fish. And he cut the fish open, and he could not believe his eyes, for out of the belly of the fish there rolled a bracelet. His mood changed. He felt happier, because now he thought that he could at least break the bracelet up and give each and every one of those people who had hunger in their eyes, whether they were of the king's religion or not, he would give them at least a piece of gold each. But when he broke the bracelet open, there was at its base a key. A key that was round and long and thin, and it did have a sign of the cross at its top. And he wondered, for he'd been by the side of the river many times, and he knew of an old walled garden, and he had seen the sign upon the lock. He turned the key in the lock. The door creaked open, and there inside he found that rich gentleman. He saw him there, his heart heavy in his chest like a stone. He saw him standing there. He said to the boy, it was a test to see how good your heart is, for you were willing to risk everything to feed others. And in this place, rich or poor, old or young, is welcome. Everyone, whether they followed one religion or another, were welcome inside of that place. The smell of cooked fish would rise from out of that walled garden, and people would stand, friends. The boy, he would always have a smile. He would always have fish to give, and friends, no matter what or who they were. The raging storm consumed the air. The lightning flashed and the thunder roared. But that was all the better for this girl. She loved the way that the wind would blow through her long curly brown hair. She was short and she was weak, and with the Vikings this was not a good thing. She would not fish like the others. She could not hunt like the others. Oh, but she could steal. She loved to take things, beautiful, bright, shining things, a brooch for a cloak, a clasp at a neck. And she would take things that did not belong to her, for she'd been exiled far away from all of the rest, away from the village and the longhouse, to a house by herself by the edge of the forest. And now, as everyone else was running out to look after the cattle that were frightened by the lightning, to corral the sheep who were frightened by the sound and the roar of the thunder. She knew that this was her chance to go inside of the longhouse and take things that did not belong to her. Everyone else always thought that they could trust the rest of the people in the village. They could leave their things where they would sleep, and no one would steal anything. But they had not counted on her. As the storm raged, she loved the way that the place was empty. And now she reached inside of a bag, and she expected to find a ring or a necklace or a bracelet to place upon her hand. She felt inside of one of the soft leather bags, and as she opened it, she saw that there was a plate, a golden plate, with writing upon it that she could not recognize. It had been scratched into that place. Now, there were great superstitions of things that lived in amongst all of the trees, but she wasn't frightened of any of those. And to look at this plate with its strange writing, its shapes, its forms, jackals and rivers and sheaves of corn and kings dressed strangely, she thought that she would take it and keep it for herself. She could see her own reflection in between the letters and shapes and forms, and she did not know that it had travelled far from Egypt to come to this place. For men had gone in not just in raiding parties in their longships, but they had travelled over land and sea. But now it was going to be hers. She placed it in the hood of her cloak, and she could feel it as it rattled and bashed against her back. It felt hard and heavy, but if she had looked, she would have seen that all of the hieroglyphs had scored themselves into her skin. But back inside of her own home, she sat by a crackling fire, and there was a cup she'd been given by her mother who had sent her to live away from the village. And as she raised it to her lips, she saw eyes at her window. Usually she wasn't frightened by anything, but there were dark eyes that were peering this way and that, and they smiled. They smiled to her, and as she drank, the world seemed to move all about her in fog and smoke that wasn't coming from the fire's flames. And then there was a great and a terrible scream. For the spirits that lived in between the trees picked her up. She could hear them whispering in her ear, "Thank you. You have freed us. You have brought the spell that has freed us from the wood, and now we will take you to a place that you will love, for you like bright and sparkling things." And they took her to a place where the mountains were made of gold. But it was gold that was in the shape of a great round, huge valley that was circled all around with water at its base, and in the water there were fish, and she had water to drink and fish to eat, and she was surrounded by gold that she could not use. She had water to drink and fish from out of the great water. Now, that settlement by the edge of the forest grew bigger, but many hundreds of years later, the body of a woman was found by the edge of golden mountains, and in her hand she had a golden plate. The archaeologists did not know where a plate that had been made in Egypt could have come to such a place, but her bones would not tell, and the story was whispered by crackling firelight. His back was always starched straight. It was as if there was a floorboard holding his back as straight as it had been in the First World War. But now, 24 years later, it was the Second World War, and he was too old to fight. But sometimes he would wear his soldier's uniform and walk around with his medals, and his uniform was getting old and threadbare. He could have fixed it, but he wouldn't spend the money. He was rich, but he wouldn't spend the money. Not on himself, not on anyone else, and not on his clothes. He lived in a burnt-out house at the edge of the huge city, a huge city that held at its heart a munitions factory, where they make bombs, guns, and bullets. And it seemed a terrible thing that they had such a dangerous factory in the middle of all of these people, but it needed the people to make the bullets. And now he heard something that he wished he could never have heard again. For he'd heard many things when he'd fought in the trenches in the First World War, but he thought he could hear bombs whistling down. For with a munitions factory in the middle of a city, it was a prime target to be bombed. And many bombing raids had come close. But now this old man thought that he could hear the whistle of bombs. And then the air raid started. And he could hear the whistle, the scream, the roar of the air raid siren. People would fight to get inside of the shelters. And rumours would pass about, and people would be told that they must be careful what they say. But that didn't stop people from gossiping. That didn't stop people from making rumours. And there was a rumour that there was someone who was going round with a gun that he would use to make sure he got a prime spot inside of the air raid shelter. And now as the old man was racing towards the air raid shelter, there was whispers, there were shouts, there was an anger in the air. And he thought that he would not risk being shot, for he had felt the sting of a bullet in his arm in the First World War. I've told you already that he was mean, and he had stolen many things. He'd kept lots of things that he'd found in the house. He'd found an old helmet, a helmet that had a spike at its top. And he thought if he wasn't going to go into that air raid shelter, then he would go into another one. But if the bombing raid was getting closer, then his house would be bombed. So he thought he would go to his house and pick up everything that was dear and precious to him, which included the German helmet. It included bows and arrows, candles and bullets, brass-clad bullets that he had found. And he put them all at his back. He carried them in an old canvas bag with his hand holding onto the handle and it bobbing on his back. But as he was running and the explosions were getting louder, things were falling out of this canvas bag. The spike at the top of the helmet poked its way right through the middle of that canvas bag and it fell down to the ground. And he did the only thing that he thought that he could do. He would place it on the top of his head. Now, he had lots of things. He had candles, he had bullets, and bullets would flash this way and that as the munitions factory was being bombed. Incendiary devices were being dropped to light the place that the bombs would fall, and now it seemed as bright as day, and still people were fighting. And it seemed that the rumour of a gun was true. And by the brightness of the fire that was burning in the whole of that huge city, one man whose rage, whose anger had put a red mist into his eyes, he looked, and he didn't think for a moment. All he could see was someone wearing an old soldier's uniform with a German helmet upon his head. And in the time that it takes to blink, he let a bullet fly through the air. The old man fell down to the ground. The helmet rolled off his head and into the gutter. His money that he'd put into the canvas bag at his back fluttered up into the air, and he wondered. For all that he had been through, he could see the heat in the air was burning the notes as they fluttered through the air like dark birds of death. And his eyes closed, and the bullets rang out through the night. But his body lay there with the German helmet not so far from his fingers. She could remember the fields when they'd been filled with corn. That was when she'd been evacuated to this farm. There were a few of the fields that were pockmarked by bombs that had been dropped, not because anybody wanted to bomb the farm, but the German bombers, if they'd been shot, then to make sure they could return to their aerodromes, they would drop the bombs anywhere and anyhow that they could. But now, the fields were white with snow. When she'd been living in the city, she'd loved the snow. But here on the farm, there was nothing to do. Nothing to do except the farm work. And now she was walking back towards the farmhouse as slowly as she possibly could, because she knew there was hay to put out into the top field for the sheep. She knew that there were cows to be milked. And the longer it took her to get there, the less work there would be for her to do. She was a city girl. To look at her, she was beautiful. To look at her, she looked sweet and kind. But her heart hung inside of her chest like a stone. She would take whatever she could. She was a growing girl, and she was always hungry. Everybody was hungry. All they had were ration books, and they would stand in line at the grocers, the greengrocers, the bakers, the butchers. They would all stand in line with their small torn-off sheets and hand them in and hope for a poor piece of meat or a small half-burnt loaf, for they would be glad for anything. And they would wait. But this girl wouldn't wait. No, not her. She would take stamps. She would take parts of the ration book, and she wouldn't stand in the queue. She would go there and she would take whatever she could to make sure she wasn't hungry. She still kept the train ticket in her pocket, the train ticket that she'd been given with a small bag of belongings to come to the farm. But now, as she was realising that perhaps she should run, because the farmer would be angry. Not that he would shout at her or scream or yell. And that was the thing that she didn't like. It would always be the look, more in sorrow than in anger. And never a fist was raised to her. But it was as she was starting to run that she slipped and she tripped and she fell. And there she could see something, white and round, with a propeller at its back. She wondered what it was. She realised that when the German bombers had been dropping their bombs so that their weight would be lighter so that they could get back to Germany to return on another bombing raid, one of the bombs hadn't exploded. And here she was at 3-acre field, and she saw the bomb, and she wondered what she could do with it. Where it was beside the walls, the old dry stone walls that were dusted with snow at their tops. And if it was to go off, then it would kill all of the sheep. And she tried to drag it as best as she could. She tried to pull it, and she dislodged it from out of the ground, and she started to pull it to the top corner. At least if she pulled it further away, then when the bomb went off, it wouldn't send all of the stones into the sheep to kill them all, so there would be no meat. And that was really what she was thinking of, her empty belly. But she started to pull it. It clanked on the stony fields. It thumped and bashed. And only as she got it to the top end, a 3-acre field, did she notice that the propeller at the top of the bomb was starting to whir round. Well, she might not have listened often at school, but she knew that when that propeller was whizzing round, it was starting the timer. But when it stopped, that was the time that the bomb would go off. And now it was whizzing round. And she ran as fast as she could to get as far away from that bomb as she could, to get away from that bomb that she'd left at the top of 3-acre field. And just as she was getting through the gate, the propeller stopped at the top of the bomb, and it caused a huge crater to be formed in the ground. And she was flung flat onto her face, and that was the last that she remembered. The next morning, she could see everybody standing around her bed. The mouths were moving and the lips were going up and down, and she guessed that words were coming out, but the bomb blast had made her temporarily deaf. If she could have heard them, I think she would have been quite surprised. They were all telling her what a hero she was, how she'd helped everyone. She quite liked the way that they were looking at her. No more in sorrow than in anger looks for her. She realised that being good was a good thing. And for the rest of the war, she wouldn't dawdle, she wouldn't linger. She would get on with her work and take her fair share and stand in line. And when she was a woman, she was grateful for the lesson that she'd learned at the farm when she'd been evacuated. And she would return to that place. And the place that she liked to stand best of all was in 2-acre field with its huge duck pond that had been made by a bomb that had been dragged there by a girl, her, when she was that girl. And she loved that place for all of the memories that it would bring back. Heavy, hard, blisteringly cold rain was falling on the ground outside. But inside of the huge antique hotel, this girl was wondering what she was going to do. She'd come to this town to visit her aunt, and her aunt had said that the two of them would go out for a walk in the park, but the rain was falling so heavy and hard that the aunt had decided not to come. And now the girl, who had travelled so far to be in this place, found herself with nothing to do. At breakfast, inside of this place, she would pull her long, straight, blonde hair away from her eyes, and it was then she looked and saw that on another table there was a girl about the same age as her, who was there, and she too looked as if she had nothing to do. She smiled. She waved to her. The girl waved back. When they'd finished their breakfast, the two of them spoke and talked, and they thought that they would visit every single inch of this great hotel. It was panelled. It had brass rails that were mirrored and polished and clean. It felt as if there was nowhere inside of the hotel that you could not see your own reflection. The floors were polished, the wood panelling on the walls was brilliant, and the two of them decided that they would explore. They would explore the whole of the ancient hotel. But on this late October, they found that just looking at things wasn't enough. It was the other girl who suggested, "Why don't we play hide and seek?" The girl, the tall girl, who had no one to wait or play with other than this girl, decided that she would say yes. The two of them started to run. They ran this way and that, and they went 1 floor, 2 floors, 3 floors. And the tall girl decided that she would go and hide on the 4th floor. It was strange because on the 4th floor, not everything seemed as polished. There was a smell of dust and damp in the air. The windows didn't seem quite as clean. The brass was covered with green, and she wondered how they'd let this part of the hotel get to be like this, especially on this Halloween evening. The hotel staff had really made an effort, not just for her and the other girl, but for all of the people who'd come to visit. They'd put skeletons in the hallway. They'd put things that would scream and yell and shout as you walked past them. And now, just at the turn of the millennium, in 1999, this girl wondered how they'd let this part of the hotel become covered in cobwebs and be so dusty and dark and damp. At the end of the corridor, where there was just a small shaft of light, she could see that there was a door that was only slightly open, and as she walked towards it, it creaked just a little bit more. This girl, good and strong, pulled her hair from out of her eyes and pushed at the door, and the door creaked right open. It was no brighter inside than the rest of this 4th floor. But as her eyes got used to the dark, she could see in one corner of the room there was something. It looked like a lamp, but it wasn't lit. It looked like a trophy case, but she couldn't see. It looked like a photo frame. Her curiosity pushed her further and deeper into the room. And she reached towards it, and she brushed her hands against it, and it was almost as if there was a glow that came from within. And she placed her 2 hands about it, and it was when she tried to move her hands away from it that she could feel herself stuck. There was a warm sensation upon her fingertips, and a dry, salty, fearful taste on her tongue. And it was then, as her eyes truly became used to the dark, that she looked and she could see 2 round, dark eyes. They came closer to her. Those 2 eyes were in her head. "Well, my dear, it is so good to see you. Hardly anyone ever visits me." It was an old woman whose face was no more than a hand's breadth away from hers. "Oh, I see that you've got your fingers stuck. Let me try and help you." The girl could barely speak, but the old woman, when she touched her, usually the girl's skin was tight and taut, but when the old woman touched her, it became slack, and the glow that came from inside of this case was brighter. The girl's fingers became released. The old woman was there. She might have been old, but her back was straight. She looked at the girl. No one ever comes and visits me. Not now. I've been here a long time." The girl looked around the room. It looked as if no one had ever been inside of this room, except from the time that the hotel was built. "No, I remember being just like you. I was very curious. I would play games in corridors, run and hide. Do you know, I've got something for you. Would you like a present, girl?" The girl still could not speak. Usually she would talk so much. But the old woman reached and brought out a beautiful robe, a gown that looked as if it had been made maybe 50, 60, 70 years before, and placed it around the girl's shoulders. The girl could see that the flesh where she had been touched by the old woman was still wrinkled and dark, and the palms of her hands seemed to be smooth. "Oh, I don't want to keep you too long," said the old woman. "You look beautiful with that." And the old woman adjusted it around the girl's neck. You look beautiful with that on. Go on, you go and play your games. Maybe you'll visit me another time. Goodbye." The girl wanted to turn and run, but she felt frightened and didn't want to turn her back to the old woman. She could feel the dress upon her back, and down the stairs she went, and her friend looked at her. She laughed. She said, "What's happened to you?" The girl didn't know what she meant. Nothing. Usually the girl would tell so many stories, and every story would last an evening, but now she did not want to talk. "Where did you get that old dress? It's beautiful. Looks like it's new. Did you get it from a costume? Did you get it from a costume shop? Is that what you're going to wear tonight for the Halloween ball? Is that what you're going to wear?" The girl couldn't speak. But it was when she looked in one of the brass rails, mirrored and polished, that she looked and saw that in her blonde hair there was a black streak of hair that ran from the front of her forehead around the full length of her hair. It was no wider than your thumb, and it stayed with her when she turned from a girl to a woman. And even when she was old and her hair was grey, there was still that black streak of hair that ran the full length. She would never speak to anyone about what happened when she'd gone into that room, of the old woman she wouldn't tell anyone. She did ask when she left, after she'd visited her aunt. She did ask at the desk, at the reception desk. She said, "Why have you let the 4th floor get so dusty and damp and dirty?" The man behind the desk looked at her and said, "I don't know what you're talking about. There are only 3 floors in this hotel." The girl ran to the lift and looked, and sure enough, the lift only went to the 3rd floor. She never returned to that place. But when it was late October, on All Hallows Even, she would reach up and touch that black streak in her hair. His words were always, "So what good is schooling to me? I have no need to read. I have no need to write." And it was true. All he had a need for was stealing other things from other people. And he was very good at that. And the only schooling he'd ever had was how to distract someone with one hand and steal with the other. Now, in the darkness of the dusk, he was coming back to his hovel of a home. He might not have any schooling, but the way that he lived did not show just how much money he had inside of his house. He kept it all inside of a purse, a woman's purse that he had stolen. But now, as he made his way through the cobbled street, he could see that there was a door that was open, and curiosity wrapped its fingers about his heart, and that was exactly where he was going to go in. He couldn't believe it. There was nobody inside of this house. Everything looked beautiful and as if prepared for a party. But everything looked old, even though these were the oldest of times, and there was no street lighting, and he was making his way along the street, and inside, by the light of candles, he could see that there was a table prepared. He wondered. The candlesticks were beautiful. The plates, the knives, the forks, they were of silver, but they were tarnished. He could tell that some of the food was past its best that was on the table. The candles had all burned down, and he just thought that some fool of a man or a woman had gone out from the house and left everything behind, and that was all the better for him. But on the table there was a note, a piece of paper, thin and flat, but yellowed at its edges. But he just looked at it. It could well have been written in some foreign language, some foreign tongue, but it was written in English, and if he'd taken the time to read it, then perhaps he wouldn't have eaten and drunk at the table as much as he did. If he'd read it, if he could have read it, then he wouldn't have taken anything. And perhaps it would have changed his ways, and he would never have stolen anything else in all of his life. But that didn't stop him now. He ate on dry cake. He pulled pieces of crust from half-eaten loaves. And if he could have read the note, then he wouldn't have taken anything. But still he took them. And all he could think about was placing candlesticks and knives and forks and spoons and plates inside of his pickpocket's pockets, inside of his great but worn cloak. I wish he could have read that note. But still, he ate. He didn't know how to use a knife or a fork, so he pulled at meat that was weevily, but he didn't care. Hunger is as hunger wants, and so he took whatever he could, and what he couldn't stuff inside of his mouth, he put inside of the great pocket, the pickpocket's pocket inside of his great cloak. He even took the note. He thought that someday perhaps he would learn to read, and then he would find out what it was that was written on this note. He took a glass. He took a cup. He took a silvered goblet, which was lined at its top with sapphires. He took it. He took them all. And now, with his belly full and his head swimming, he walked his way along the road, the cobbled streets, in the darkness, back to his own home. Now he tasted and tasted everything, but the note was rested against that silver goblet. I wish he could have read the note. But when he got back, he lit himself a candle, and he placed the candle, a tallow candle, inside of one of the fine candlesticks. He carried the silver goblet really carefully. And it was when he sat, laughing to himself with all of the things that weighed his cloak down, that he decided he would drink the liquid. It was thick, it was red, and it was sweet. He drank the liquid that was inside of the silver goblet, and he held the note in his hand. He screwed his eyes up to try and see if it would make some sense. He could barely recognise his own name, but then again, what schooling did he need to pick pockets? He took the silver goblet. He looked out of the window, not knowing that this would be the last he would ever see from out of the window. No, it would be the last that he would ever see in all of his short life. And he lifted the liquid, and it was thick and it was sweet upon his tongue and teeth. Everything seemed to go dark. He looked towards the candle, and that seemed darker. And if he had only taken the time to do some schooling, and he had taken the time to learn how to read, and if he could have read the note, then as the silver goblet fell from his hand and spilt down upon the ground, it turned bitter upon his lips and teeth and tongue, and the note spilled from out of his hand and lay upon the floor. Weeks, months later, his body was found. And if he had taken the time to learn how to read, then the note would have told him, for it read like this: all who take what does not belong to them, when once it is sweet upon their tongue, it will be the last that they taste. All food that they take will rot in their belly, and their eyes will close, never to open again.